Chapter 11. Rough and Simple Defense. The sun shone for a while, and I washed my kanji. Miyu's skin was too tender to be afraid of long sun exposure. I picked her up and went back to the cave. Sarit had already roasted the meat, and we all had a good time eating it. I was very happy to see her, and I was very happy to see her. I said to them, "This cave is too big. It's dangerous to open it in the dark at night. We need to find something to block it." Having just looked at the surroundings, this is a vast tropical forest, and it's almost impossible to walk out. From today onwards, we need to stock up on food and plan for the long haul. Miyu gave me a look, and I thought how sad she must be that Po and Sarit no longer have family and attachments. As long as they are with me, everywhere is home for both of them. Miyu, on the other hand, has a family and a husband and a lot of attachments, and she must try to cut off her love affair if she never gets off this pristine island. After the bear meat, I assigned Po and Sarit the task of yarding rocks next to the small waterfall in front of the cave entrance, just as I had done yesterday when catching fish. A pit had formed where the stream had washed down, so I got under the waterfall and fished out the rocks underneath against the current, increasing the depth of the pit as much as possible to make a small pool. After picking up all the rocks, the pool had taken shape, with a concave rock surface underneath. Next, Sarit and Po did as I asked, finding flat rocks to pile up and enclose the pool so that only water could flow through the gap. Po asked me, "Are we going to bathe in it?" I looked at her big, innocent eyes and said, "I'm not afraid of fish bites, so I'll just wash in it." Sarit giggled and pulled Po's arm, and Po still blinked at us with big, hesitant eyes. "For fish, not bath." Sarit still couldn't resist and explained to Po, a naive little girl. Po realized that I was teasing her and pouted and joined Sarit in building the stones again. "You guys barricade the perimeter solidly and add a few extra layers around the outside. I'm going to cut down tree poles for the cave door and try to have it done by nightfall." After saying this, he picked up the dirigible gun and dagger at the cave door and went along the stream to cut branches not far below. After walking not too far, he saw a small forest with many small arm-thick trees, each about 4 or 5 meters high. If you cut them down and weave them into a hedge gate, then tie them up tightly with tongue stems, and block the entrance to the cave at night, jungle leopards and wild bears are generally hard to break through. About 50 or 60 of these poles were needed to create a cave door large enough. In order to increase the efficiency of felling, I adjusted myself to a state of military emergency defense. On an isolated island, it's really a contest of life and death. The underside of each tree was notched by my dagger, and if I continued to cut, the dagger would not be able to swing with enough force. When each tree was cut down to 2/3 of its circumference, I backed up 10 meters, then ran with power and flew up to deliver a side kick like a battlefield tearing down an enemy. Trees on the island, being tropical, generally grow fast and have brittle wood. Almost a flying kick toppled a chopped tree. Occasionally, there is a sturdy tree that did not fall, and then used the dagger to cut the bottom and continue to fly kick. In less than 3 hours, I got a lot of trees. Then I hit the chipping glow with my dagger, lifting 4 or 5 at a time over my shoulder and carrying them towards the cave entrance. Po and Sarit had fenced off the puddle pool in a sturdy and aesthetically pleasing way, the stream above falling steeply from 10 meters, making the puddle pool splash with white water. The two girls, already tired and sweaty, sat down on the edge of the stream to rest, looking at me and smiling. Sarit said, "Why don't we help you move the wood too?" Time was actually running out, so I nodded and told them to be careful with their fingers and not to cut them. Both of them were also happy that they could help me again and followed along to move the wood. Even though it was 2 girls, the work went a lot faster with the extra ones. They both carried one by one towards the hole, Sarit carrying the big one and Po the small one. After all the wood was moved to the cave entrance, I went and cut down a lot of pliable rattan plants to use as ropes for preparing the gate. In order to make the gate strong and not easily breached by fierce beasts, concave chow were cut out of each piece of wood, which could be kissed and bitten between the horizontal and vertical. Afterwards, securely fasten each intersection with a cane stem. Having made up a sheltering stick board, it was stood up in the mouth of the cave, just covering it. There were fist-sized hollows in the rocky walls of the cave entrance, into which the 2 ends of the crosspieces at the top of the stick board were inserted, and the entrance to the cave was hung like a curtain. Then, leaving Po and Icarus to hold on, I climbed back up to the rocky roof of the cave and strangled the wooden gate with thick hemp vines, securing it to two stout trees. This way the gate could be lifted up and covered down at will as people entered and exited, without worrying about it falling down. By the time we got everything done, it was dark. The seabirds on the island, for safety, always returned to their nests early. We also had to get into our holes early, and taking the artemisia and bear skins that had been dried during the day into the holes, Sarit and Po began to carefully lay them out. I put all the bear meat that had been sunning all day into the cave. Having added some wet pieces of wood freshly cut to the fire, I cut off a large piece with my dagger and roasted it over the tumbling smoke. It was a type of bacon, and there had been many times when jungle fighting that it had been eaten this way. Now we sat around the campfire, much more collapsed. Thick rock formations wrapped around us, and the only exit was blocked by thick pole gates. Miyu had been sitting quietly in the cave with her baby in her arms after her daytime shower, and was in a much better mood as she watched us work and talk at the entrance. The bear meat was quickly roasted, and I used my dagger to cut it into many small pieces so that they could eat it by squeezing it in their hands. Everyone was starving tonight, and luckily it was a bear, not a rabbit, that was killed, or we certainly wouldn't have had enough to eat tonight. I told them that my plan for tomorrow was to catch a lot of trout in the creek and stock the repaired puddle. It would be good to have something to eat if there was a series of rainstorms on the island. Sarit and Po had spread the dried artemisia very neatly, and the soft bearskin was spread out on it, and it was much more comfortable to lie on than it had been last night. They also put extra thick artemisia under Miyu's rubber raft, and Miyu slept with the baby, which was now both cozy and spacious. I sat by the fire, sharpening thin strips of wood with my dagger, trying to make a half-open wooden basket with which to catch fish tomorrow. I couldn't just beat them to death with a stick like I did last time, and the fresher I caught them tomorrow, the better. Sarit motioned for me to go over and squeeze in between her and Po to sleep, and I didn't say anything as I continued to make the wooden baskets for fishing. Looking at the large, heavy wooden door of the cave building was a much improved sense of security and a reminder of the day's heavy labor and the difficulty of being sleepy. But I still wanted to weave this wooden basket before going to bed. Po came over and took my arm and insisted that I go to bed. I told her to go back to bed. The basket would be finished soon. Po, more like a naive child, pouted again without saying anything and continued to insist on pulling on my arm. I had to put down the tools I was about to make and go to sleep on that big bearskin. Sarit saw me coming and leaned his body to one side as I lay down. Tiredness immediately rushed into my brain, and Po lay down with me, snuggling into my arms, lifting one of my arms over her own, so that I could sleep with her in my arms. Tonight she was too much like a willful child, and soon fell asleep in my arms, and my arms wrapped round her felt so soft, and countless pities flooded my heart. Sarit also fell asleep against me, her soft and bouncy teenage, P***sy, climbing and resisting my firm back. I could clearly feel the heat radiating from both girls' hips and every organ of their bodies. Tiredness kept rolling through my brain as I looked at the sturdy door again and thought about how beasts don't understand the motion of lifting up. They just slam forward and never get inside. Even if a savage had appeared, it would have been difficult to lift the gate and enter. For the two huge stones in the cave were secured by me with hemp vines, pulling tightly inwards to tug on the gate. If it did open, the rolling boulder would be the first to wake me up in time to take defense. Miyu's baby cried once in the night, probably because Miyu got up to pee and woke him up. I have always retained a habit of being particularly sensitive to any slightest rattling in my sleep. Miyu walks barefoot on the rocks, the soft, tender flesh and flat, hard rock making a thick, jointing sound. My eyes were closed and the top of my head could feel Miyu's movements as she lifted her sheepskin kangaroo and squatted down, followed by her tiny breaths. Miyu must have been holding it in for a long time, the hot urine causing her to let out a soft whimper as it drained from her organ. I think her wounds must not have adjusted to the temperature and the spraying brush. Miyu was both afraid of disturbing us and embarrassed herself, as the liquid she discharged continued to wash over the surface of the rock in small, smooth clatters that were particularly loud in the silent cave. When the impact was particularly loud, she would deliberately contract her organ, causing a sudden break in the sound, before slowly draining it outwards. The sound faded, but Miyu didn't move, remaining still and crouching for a while. She was afraid of interfering with the healing of the wound, letting the washed-out furry fur drip a drop of the urine that had stuck to it. After hearing that Miyu was fine and that I was able to pee on my own without any problems, I let my mood drop again and let my brain sink into a stupor. All is well tonight, and slept well. The wooden door is so valuable to make. The chirping of various birds outside the cave is starting to sound. Miyu was tired from taking care of the kids last night and is probably just now collapsing into a deep sleep. Po is already awake and is looking at me with his big, bony eyes as he sleeps, and Sarit, who had a particularly hard time lifting the rocks last night, is still sleeping close to my back. As soon as I opened my eyes, I saw Po's tippy-toeing eyes, very mischievous and locked with mine. I stroked her head and asked her in a low voice if she wanted to go catching fish with me. Po didn't say a word and nodded to me silently. I got up and went to the fire, picked up the wooden basket, and finished the rest of the process. Taking Po with me, I gently pushed up the gate and walked out. The air on the island was still a little damp and cool at the moment, so Po took the wooden basket for fishing, and I carried my weapon, one after the other, along the stream. Yesterday, when I was mowing Artemisia, the sizable greenish-black trout in the nearby section of the stream were scared in all directions by me. Now when I came nearby, sure enough, there were still plenty of trout schooling up and down the stream. I pulled Po and hurriedly dodged aside to prevent scaring them off. After analyzing the alignment of the creek gully, it was time to sneak around downstream of them with Po and start yarding rocks in a relatively narrow section of the creek. Chapter 12. Capturing the Weak. Soon, we both blocked a ledge with rocks, and in a few moments the school of dodgy trout would be thrashing around down there in a state of alarm and urgency. To keep the fish out of harm's way when they were caught, Po and I circled back upstream of the school of trout. Finding a narrow mouth of the stream, we also put up a rock barrier to block their way back upstream. Now the trout could only escape back and forth in short sections of the stream, and I could easily snare them by lifting the braided wooden basket. The catching begins as Po stands in the stream with his straight, white little legs bare, holding a thin wooden stick and coaxing the fish away. The trout only then realized we were both there, their fat tails flopping and running backwards. I, on the other hand, was well in front of the goofy bunch, waiting for them to come over and fall into the net. Snapping down, 3 of the lumbering ones were caught, and a dozen others scurried across my crotch, their slippery bodies rubbing against my ankles. Po, happy to see that I'd snapped a fish, ran over to me and crouched down at the heel of the wooden basket to peer in, big curious eyes, blinking in front of me. I told Po to hold down the wooden basket so the trout didn't escape. I dug out another small pit at the edge of the stream and put the caught fish in it first. As the trout's skin was slippery, I took it out by pinching its gills and tail with both hands and carefully placed it in a small pit beside me. Po was again happy to coax away the frightened trout, which were piling up at the downstream rocky ledge, and still I stood in the middle, holding up the wooden basket, ready to snap at any trout that swam past in panic. After a few repetitions back and forth, more than 24 anadromous trout were caught, huddled in small, dug-out pits spitting white foam. With frightened black eyes, their greenish-gray tails stirred the muddy water from side to side. When they saw Po and I approaching, they even flicked their tails hard to get away, but arched their mouths. Po was more excited than I was to see the bounty. How do we bring all these fish back to the cave pit pool? This was a question she had neglected to ask, and for a moment I was out of ideas. Then you come up with an idea. Po listened to me, placed her little hand on her pouting mouth, and began to think. This naive little girl, where is the experience of survival in the wilderness? Thought for half a day and still did not have a note. Finally sighed, "Hey." Disappointed look at me. I said, "Use Artemisia grass on the bottom of the basket, put the trout in, and then cover the top with dampened Artemisia grass. That way the trout won't dry out by the time we get back to the hole." Po clapped and jumped for joy when she heard me finish. She began to naturally exude the innocence of a 13-year-old girl, a far cry from the girl who had visited my loft on a rainy night. Following my instructions, we both loaded the trout into wooden baskets and started back to the cave. Po walks mischievously ahead of me, shaking the strip of wood in her hand that she just used to drive the fish away, her pink feet kicking up the occasional splash in the stream and the excitement of the fish she just caught. I followed her, clutching the wooden basket with the trout, looking at her narrow spine, her tall frame. She was 3 years younger than Sarit. Her breasts and are nowhere near as ripe and full as Sarit's, yet she was straight up and tall. I asked Po, "Can you sing?" She suddenly slowed down her walk and said, "Yes, but not for you." I asked Po why she didn't sing to me, and Po said, "It's a song for lovers. My mom taught me that." It turns out that her naivety hides a teenage shyness. She mentioned her mother, which reminded me of the town. I thought of the old tavern, the buxom woman in the tailor's shop, and the villains who burned the village. I said to Po, "You sing. Just think of me as your lover boy." Po stopped, looked back at me, lowered his head again, and said slowly, "You're Sarit's lover boy. Make her sing to you." Seeing that she had suddenly become formal, she must have been remembering her hometown, her suffering mother, and her own birth. "Then what am I to you?" She was a bit at a loss for words, and it was as if I was seeing a shadow of her past again, the girl who slept in my attic bed. "You're the owner. My mom gave me to you." She thought she had just angered me with her perkiness and started to panic a little. I continued talking to her. "Master, what if I asked you to get naked and sleep with me right now?" Po's head hung lower and she winced a little. "Talk," I asked him with slight force. I'd be scared." She sounded a little hoarse. "Sleep even if you're scared. Sleep now, take it off," I repeated. Po slowly raised her shivering hands to her collar, stumbling to undo the buttons. Tears began to circle her large eyes and her long lashes fluttered. "Silly girl, if the trout dries up and dies, we'll have wasted our time. Let's go." After saying that, I held the wooden basket and walked up first. By the time Po slowed down, I had already taken more than 10 steps, and the snapping of the stream resounded from behind as Po caught up. "Are you teasing me?" she asked me tentatively. "No one owns you. This is no longer a small town. On this island, every soul is afraid of being alone, so be equal and caring." When I finished, I asked her if she understood what I meant, and Po nodded. "Stop thinking of me as your master. I'll get angry," I admonished her once more. "And what do I take you for?" I was a little helpless, regretting that I shouldn't have teased her earlier. "Being a family member," I told her in a low voice. She began to ponder my words again. I urged her once again to get moving, or the trout would really dry out. She only slightly regained her spunky nature from earlier, and with an oh-so-subtle grunt, she came right back after me. "Po, do you think I'm better for Sarit than I am for you?" Po shook his head. I continued to tell her, "You and Sarit are both my family, and in my mind there is no one good or bad in either of you. You are 3 years younger than Sarit, and in many ways I am spoiling you." She didn't seem to understand the meaning of my words until now and thought I was talking to her very seriously. "So, when you sleep at night, can you still hold me?" This childish remark of hers made me pause. When I asked why, she said she was afraid that I would leave her behind. My heart also heaved, suddenly feeling a great responsibility, even fearing that one day I would not protect them and lose one. I said I had a lot of things to do today, so hurry up. When I came to the cave, Po was still behind me, shaking the branches as I walked. Sarit had woken up and just happened to be squatting by the stream in front of the cave entrance to pee. Seeing my sudden appearance, he could not get up or squat. As I continued to carry the basket towards the pit, Po appeared behind me and saw Sarit just halfway through her peeing session, in a state of nervous embarrassment. He made a face at Sarit and laughed at her shyness. The trout in the wooden baskets were well protected by the damp artemisia, and as soon as they were emptied into the puddle pool, they immediately waved their tails to the bottom. The depth of this pool was something they had not felt in the stream, and the rock formations that sank to the bottom really thought that the trace had been successful. Unbeknownst to them, it was the beginning of the fate of the filler's fruitful belly. Sarit finished peeing and stood up and came over to look at Po and me as well. Finding a black swarm of trout at the bottom of the pool, He was surprised and said, "Caught so many." Po looked at me and said to Sarit with a wry smile, "Trout love to sleep, so we caught them." The playfulness of this little guy was truly a joy we rarely have on this lonely island. Sarit heard Po laughing at the fact that she got up later than her and smiled and stroked her head, calling her a brat. I asked Miyu if she woke up and Sarit said no. I told Sarit to grill a fish for Miyu's breakfast as Miyu doesn't exercise much and can't digest bear meat easily, and the nutrition of trout will also make Miyu milky. When I finished, I gave her one of the purposely leftover ones from the wooden basket, and Sarit took the fat trout, smiling as she went into the hole with Po to grill the food. There is still wood left from yesterday in the hole, and I pick out some to make up another plank to cover the top of the pit tank. Keeps the trout from jumping out and running away, or being stolen by wild animals in the middle of the night. As this stickboard was not made as large as yesterday's, the manufacture was completed in a moment's work. It was moved up and fastened to the mouth of the pool, and two very heavy boulders were pressed on it. Walking into the cave, Po and Sarit were roasting food and the smell of meat was overflowing. Miyu had also woken up from her nap and was combing her hair with her slender fingers. Her hair was long and soft, the loose ends rubbing against her white breasts, exuding the flavor of a mature woman. I knew from last night that she could slowly get up and try to walk. Miyu smiled extra sweetly at me, knowing that it was my idea to grill fish for her to eat. She had just woken up from a nap and had a tired look on her face. Miyu beckoned to me, signaling me to come closer to her. I went over and gently crouched down in front of her, thinking she had something to say, but instead she put her arms around my neck, her flirtatious face and flashing bright eyes signaling for me to pick her up. Turns out she had to go out for a pee. I took her by the shoulders and pedaled her plump, soft legs with my right hand. She was still naked underneath, with only a sheepskin kangaroo. The moment I picked up Miyu, the scent of her body after a night's sleep rushed into my breath. The scent of her beautiful, ripe body mingled with the freshness of milk and the faint smell of urine on her buttocks. The fuzzy hairs of her shy private parts must still be dry with last night's urine. Miyu was carried out of the cave, with some of the damp coolness of the night still lingering in the early morning air. I couldn't put her directly on the cold stones so that she would squat to urinate on her own. She had no shoes or clothes, only the sheepskin kangaroo I had given her, and her body, as it was still afraid of the cold. I had to put Miyu's back on my chest, two arms to move her soft white thighs, gently squatting against the stream, Miyu peeing. Miyu right hand grasped my arm to maintain the balance of the body, the left hand to the lower body, with the feeling of plucking away the pubic hairs that are tangled together. In order not to touch the injured area, her forefinger and middle finger try to separate the two small sticky lips. Then she closes her eyes and regulates the nerves and organs of excretion. Miyu's full flesh is pressed against my chest while my hand rests under her delicate soft thighs, and I can fully feel the workings of her body. A jet of tea-yellow urine came out and crashed into the flowing stream in an arching arc. My face was resting just behind Miyu's neck, my eyes sliding from her pale, plump breasts down the open cleavage to the arched fuzz of her belly. Pressed together, I could strongly feel her convulsions caused by the instant rush of wet, hot urine. This time, the sound of the arc crashing into the stream didn't stop and continued. It was a long while before the arc gradually descended. I think Miyu must be suffocating. Last night she didn't want to disturb us, and she barely got up alone to take a leak inside the cave. And now that she can get comfortable, Miyu's left hand hasn't come up yet, and I think by not raising it, she's not letting me carry her up in the first place. Miyu lay motionless against my arms as she waited for the droplets of liquid hanging down there to drip clean. I couldn't see down there with my vision, but could feel her organ contracting down there as she moved from one side to the other. The moist scent of urine and the open organ of her private parts gave off a sultry odor that filled the area around my nose, making me a little mesmerized and dizzy. After a while, Miyu drew back her left hand, twisted her somewhat flushed face, and gave me a soft, kind look. Knowing that she was ready, I twisted her body around and carried Miyu back again as I had just carried her out of the cave. Chapter 13. The Bride in the Attic Bed. The trout was charred and oily and Miyu ate it while smiling happily. The roasted bear meat was cut into small dices with my dagger to make it easy for Poe and Sarit to eat. I asked Poe and Sarit if the urine color was very yellow. They both looked at each other and nodded at me at the same time. I said, "No more raw water. You have to eat proper vegetables and porridge soup." Sarit asked me where I could find a cooking pot. I thought for half a day and told her that she could make one out of stone. After the meal, I found a piece of granite rock that resembled a pot. Taking a stone, I drew a circle at the top and started chiseling the pit with my dagger. The military dagger was sharp and the rock was hard. The chiseling was slow, but it still produced results. By the time the sun was setting, the granite was taking shape, looking more like rough stone pots, and Poe and Sarit found some square pieces of stone outside the cave and yarred them around the fire so that the pots would crouch securely on top of them, and the pots were ready. We filled a banana leaf with water and poured it in, adding firewood underneath. In no time at all, the stream began to bubble and boil away. In preparation for a long stay, I chiseled and carved a few more wooden cups and wooden spoons and forks to keep us in civilized eating habits. In the evening, I took out a trout at the pit pond and proceeded to grill it for Miyu. Instead, the bear meat was cooked in a stone pot. I asked Sarit and Poe how it tasted when cooked, and they both shook their heads and said it wasn't good. I didn't think it tasted good either, although it was much better than roasting it over a wildfire. It made me nostalgic for the pastrami in the town pubs and the bacon in the attic. The flavor was so different. I said I'd try to find salt and spices tomorrow. It's easy to find spices or substitutes for cooking meat in tropical island forests. Poe happily said, "Then tomorrow is still an early start. I will go with you." I said, "No, you have to stay in the cave and take care of Miyu. Searching for spices is dangerous. You may come across wild animals. Sarit and I will go out." Poe listened to me. Her eyes dropped, her head bowed, and she expressed her displeasure with silence. I stroked her head and said, "Watch out, Miyu. I'll take you with me next time I catch a fish." She cheered up at that. Sarit laughed at the sight of Poe's childish behavior, her delicate jade hand covering her rosy lips. Miyu didn't quite get the point of our conversation, but she smiled daintily at the sight of Poe's well-behaved temper. After everyone had eaten their fill and had some soup on wooden utensils, they felt very comfortable. There is not much firewood left for the fire, so we will have to get some more tomorrow. When it was time to sleep, Miyu and the baby remained on the rubber raft, with the thick artemisia grass underneath to keep them cool and warm. I also slept between Poe and Sarit. I was strong and had a lot of body heat, and when it got cold in the cave at night, the two of them huddled close to me for warmth. Poe, as usual, was like a child, pulling my arms through before each lie down, using one to pillow her head, causing one to rest on her. Sarit was sleeping late into the night with her breasts pressed against my back and her hands resting on my ribs. This night, the baby didn't cry, and Miyu didn't get up to pee. Poe's head was on my chin, her luscious nose and mouth breathing in and out, and the warm, moist streams of air sprayed rhythmically on my chest. When I think of the look and actions of this little girl who was bluffed by me during the day, I can't help but hold her a little tighter again. She's still a child and doesn't know anything about men and women, perhaps treating sex with me as a minor operation that won't kill her. If I don't make this trip out to sea, Sarit should be living in my loft, naked and cuddling with me every night. She was raw in her psychology and experience of sex, but meek and soft with me. I do not know why. Miyu looked at my eyes, more and more full of tenderness. That surge of intoxicating eyes, sometimes staring straight to the eye, cannot help but want to go close. We are in a predicament, just like those trout in the stream. The only difference is that we gave up the impossible trace. The fire was still flickering and the shadows were jumping across the rock walls. Thoughts jumped through my brain and my eyelids felt the light as if my fireplace was at my heels and I was lying on a wooden bed in the attic. It was the first time in days that I had begun to remember the past, and the night was already very late. Suddenly, I heard a movement outside the hole, as if the trout in the pit pond had recognized the situation and were drumming their tails to leap out and escape. This was what I had expected, so I covered the top with stick boards during the day to become a heavenly prison for the trout. There was a rumbling sound. I think it was a stone lay that collapsed, and I sat up in a hurry. Even if the trout were united in a simultaneous effort, It would be impossible to knock down the thick stone lay. Unless, of course, something dangerous was destroying it. The sound of the rocks collapsing and me sitting up sharply also woke the three women. They looked with frightened eyes at the darkness outside the cave and then at me, waiting for my judgment and measures. I grabbed the mill gun that I had placed above my head before I went to bed, picked up a still, burning stick from the fire, and threw it at the entrance to the cave. The stick rolled a few times and stopped, and in the dim light, I could vaguely see a massive object out there, picking its way through the pit pool and sticking its head in to eat our stockpile of trout. The stone barriers that had been used to enclose the pit pool had been overwhelmed by its heavy body, and the 20 or so trout gibbered and flapped their tails and bounced about, and the huge bear picked up one at random, and tilting its neck, with its mouth shrugged towards the sky, swallowed the fish and chewed it. The giant bear clucked and chewed on the juicy trout, while glancing obliquely at the knob of fire stick with his eyes as if it were nothing. Poe shuddered in Sarit's arms and winced. "Our fish?" I hastily signaled her to keep quiet. It was the first time I had seen a bear that huge. I think it must have gone to the stream at night to catch fish, but followed the smell of cooking meat to the cave. Its keen sense of smell led it to discover a large number of trout gathered in the pit pool, so it peeled off the rocks pressed against it and enjoyed with impunity the food that was already ours. This time, facing this behemoth, I was nervous to the limit. Firstly, the light was so poor that I couldn't hit it in the vitals with a single shot. Hitting it on its thick skin wouldn't necessarily scare it away, and would most likely enrage it and endanger ourselves. Although the wooden door of the cave entrance was sturdy, it would be hard to tell if this big guy rammed it a few times. I'm hoping he'll try to eat as many of those trout as he can to fill his stomach and make him give up the idea of turning on us. "Sarit, throw me all the remaining bear meat, quick," I ordered her in a small but urgent voice. Sarit panicked for a moment and quickly understood what I meant. Hurrying to the innermost corner of the cave, she carried a few huge pieces of bear meat and placed them behind me. I hung the bear meat on a very long stick and poked it through a crack in the wooden door of the cave, using as much air as I could to poke the meat far enough away to keep the bear away from the cave. Stabbing out 30 or 40 pounds of meat in a single breath, the giant bear was outside, chewing and blathering with a mouth full of nourishing saliva. I turned my head and gestured in a motion to Miyu to coax the baby and never let it cry. Miyu nodded firmly and looked at me with fear and encouragement in her eyes. I went back to watching the movement outside. I couldn't make out what it looked like in the darkness, but my face could feel the breath driven up as its body twisted. If this big guy broke through the door with ferocity, we'd be a bloody mess in no time. The giant bear seemed to be well fed, and I heard its ramrod-thick burps as it rubbed its nose on the wooden door of the cave entrance, from side to side, and after sniffing it, shifted its haughty body and walked away. I think its stomach must have been full to the brim to have not animalistically attacked us, but bears have a pretty good sense of smell and memory. I'm really afraid it will digest too quickly and come back after dawn and use us for breakfast. However, what was feared didn't happen. The giant bear didn't come back, and I don't know which direction towards the island it took off. My back was soaked, and Poe and Sarit, along with Miyu, who was holding the baby, huddled into the corner behind the cave. They were really freaking out. None of us said a word, with the thrill of what we had just seen still in our hearts. Finally, the cool calls of the seabirds could be heard again, and gradually there was light outside the cave. There was no way to make breakfast today. All the trout and bear meat was taken by the giant bear. The three women lost their laughter and heavy hearts hung on their faces. I told none of them to go out, and sensing the outside of the cave, I carefully lifted the wooden door and walked out with my weapon. One was to make sure the giant bear was gone, and the other was to find some food to fill my stomach. Along the stream, I walked cautiously, trying to find a few trout. It is possible that the giant bear left and went down the stream, scaring the anadromous trout back downstream. Eventually, I had to find some plants to go back and feed myself. There are so many different kinds of plants in the tropical island forest that if you are not careful, you can accidentally eat fungi and fruits that contain toxins. When I was fighting in the jungles of Thailand, I once ate a poisonous fruit, and I vomited and fainted, but the medic injected me with antibodies in time to save my life. Since entering this deserted island, I have tried to hunt as much meat as possible to minimize the risk of food poisoning. After turning around for a full hour without finding any edible plants, I returned to the cave empty-handed. They were all glad to see me back safe and sound, and as for food, they showed no disappointment. For hunger at this moment is so far from the days of wandering at sea. Po runs over to me and rushes into my arms, wrapping her arms tightly around my back and pressing her soft face against my chest.
I'm scared.
I stroked her head and looked at Sarit and Miyu. There was a panic in both their eyes too. The bear threatened us, not only with mental stress, but also with a food crisis. The bear left with a full stomach and will surely come back to haunt us in the future, draining us of our hard-earned food, and it has certainly become a robber of our existence. If one day it gets hungry again, and we can no longer provide sufficient food, as we did last night, then our bodies will suffer. Chapter 14. The Amputation Trap. Sometimes panic is worse than the reality of the predicament. If we don't adjust everyone's mindset as soon as possible, it's like sitting on the sidelines. I told them not to be afraid of the giant bear, and that they should be stronger after experiencing the sea drift and the test of life and death. They smiled and nodded their heads with some death-defying conviction so that I wouldn't worry. Comforting them and freeing myself from the tension, I said, Sarit, you come with me, and we will continue with last night's plan. Po and Miyu are in the cave and must not take a step out. It is very unlikely that wild animals will attack people during the day, unless they are hungry leopards. Po's eyes were red. I knew she was timid and afraid of the beasts. Miyu rushed to hold Po's head in her arms and comforted her. I am grateful to this woman who is older than me, although she has been hurt and weak, at least from the spirit of sharing a lot of my stress. On the way out, handed Miyu and Po a pistol each, just in case. Coming out of the cave, I moved a few more boulders to press under the wooden door, grabbed the mill gun and headed deeper into the island with Sarit. She was behind me and had the pistol I gave her in her hand as well. Tall, thick woods with lots of leafy plants. It was humid all around, and the dew dampened me and Sarit's bodies. I gripped Sarit's hand behind me, deeply afraid that I would turn around and lose her. It is painful to lose your partner in such a primitive forest. I wielded my dagger and tried my best to cut and slash the vine branches that blocked my progress. Because some of them have spikes growing on them, Sarit's skin and flesh are too tender to be easily injured. She followed me closely, afraid of being separated from me. Today's task for both of us was to get some sea salt and spices. Fresh spices for porridge and sea salt to keep our strength and dark hair. The way to get it is seawater to dry. If we followed the route to the island in the first place, it would inevitably take us 4 or 5 hours to get to the sea. As I observed the day before when I threw the bear's skeleton, it was about an hour through the edge of this dense rainforest. Grabbing Sarit's hand, I kept going deeper and deeper. The scent of the forest changed a little. I could smell the distinctive odor of spice plants wafting from the slough that leaned into the shore, and I could faintly hear the sound of a stream gurgling. The light and darkness of the dense forest crossing was particularly intimidating. Sarit's hand was gripped tightly in mine. Holding her small hand hard would make her feel secure, and I quickened my pace, pulling her in the direction of the growing spice plants. Narrow paths with cross-growing plants in the way, or that required touching my body to cross, were crossed by me first, then guided carefully by Sarit. She listened nervously and meekly, accepting my protection. Walking out of that dense section of rainforest, an open stream appeared as far as the eye could see, and from the course of the turbulence, it was evident that it flowed into the sea below the island. The smell emanating from the spice plants became stronger, and it was guessed that it would be nearby. Recall standing on top of the cave and observing the scene, roughly deducing that I was now on a bearing that was leaning against the edge of that vast primeval rainforest. I knew that further in, the likelihood of encountering danger would greatly increase. But for the sake of the spice, for the sake of a stoic existence later on, so that no one would give up hope of staying alive, the risk was necessary and retreat was a dead end. The air is filled with steaming white watery smoke, accentuating the antiquity and mystery of the ecosystem. I look back at Sarit, who is sweating profusely and has infinite depth in her dark eyes. "Are you scared?" I asked. She shook her head. I continued to look into the depths of her bright eyes, and she got a little nervous. Scared. Another nod came out. Well, if you are afraid, tell me and let me take the blame. It will be easier for you. Life and death have faded for me. My hope now is to protect you. I reached out and wiped the sweat from her forehead. She closed her eyes and let me wipe it off for her. I said to her again, remember, when you get into the quagmire in a while, if danger occurs, you have to run backwards as hard as you can. Don't look back and don't look at me. You escape so that I can concentrate on the battle with all my might. Sarit's eyes were red, tears hung in the corners of her eyes and hesitated to fall. Her head leaned against my chest, hugged my arm and said, if you die, none of us will survive. Don't leave me behind. I'm your woman. I hadn't realized that she had such a deep understanding of feelings for a 16-year-old girl. I cradled her head tightly in my left arm, my eyes looking around, watching for danger. Fingers wiped the corners of her moist eyes. Sarit, you are homesick, aren't you? You've secretly cried on my back during the night. Sarit's head nodded in my arms and hummed. Do you know why I brought you out? Sarit shook her head in the negative. I told her, because I'm afraid. I'm really afraid of coming back to the cave one day and realizing you're all gone. Miyu may be a shipwrecked Japanese woman, but I've thought of her as family since the moment I got to the island and realized that none of us would be able to leave. Sarit didn't say a word, her head twisting in my arms, tears smeared on my chest. I knew she understood, could even comprehend the deeper meaning of my words. I took her hand and began to walk towards the muck. I made Sarit stand in front of me and walk into my protective line of sight. The animals in the undergrowth like to attack those behind them. During the day, the island evaporates so much that the quagmire, though wet, is out of its swampy state. And I push on Sarit's shoulder, specializing in the lighter-colored muddy surfaces to keep from sinking into the man-eating pools. Knee-high soft plants were spread out in handfuls, and I told Sarit to try to move around those bushes, which might be coiled with poisonous snakes or evil insects. Sarit was much braver than earlier after crying from my arms. She moved forward boldly and tentatively. When I was walking in the woods just now, I had sharpened a wrist-thick wooden stick in advance, probably more than 2 meters long, specifically for picking off small snakes slithering in the branches. This moment the wooden stick as usual came in handy. It can poke the mud surface on the ground. If the inside is empty, we immediately flash away to go. Sarit's shoulders are soft, and I pick at her shoulders, feeling her flabby bones to the fullest. A body like this would quickly strangle its bones and suffocate to death if entangled in a python. I whispered to Sarit, at the first sign of danger, you are to turn behind me immediately and run back to the creek on the same route you came. Sarit nodded. Stop. Sarit's body shuddered and she let out a soft ah, perhaps startled by me. Or perhaps I had pinched her. What do you see in front of you? I continued to whisper to Sarit. Dead wood, half a trunk. Sarit asked her because she thought I couldn't see it clearly. I said, no, step on it and half your calf is gone. Don't move. The rainforest around us was still steaming with water vapor, and the sun was shining extra strong at this point. Sarit looked out and shifted his body a little. A crocodile, a camouflaged crocodile. She spoke to me in a sultry voice. It was assumed that the crocodile had been camouflaged in place for half a day, its wide-open mouth drying and somewhat whitened, its sharp teeth gleaming the white of dry desert bone, wrongly exposed outside its mouth. The eyes were like the eyes of a dry tree, and the wide jaws were wrapped as if in the bark of an aspen tree. The body was greenish-grayish white-black scales, scattered on the spine and limbs like ancient armor, one piece stretching from the broad skull to the tail. It was about 1.5 meters long, and I could tell it was a young male crocodile. I pulled Sarit behind me and told her to back up 20 meters along the route she had just taken. She immediately and cautiously carried out my order. I crouched down slowly, giving the crocodile the illusion that I hadn't spotted the trap. Then untying the laces on my riding boots, I pulled out a dagger and fixed it firmly to the end of a wooden stick. The first time I was stranded on a desert island, I learned to trap crocodiles with a spear from the natives. Now, was about to make an improvised spear to hunt this guy who set up the trap. After tying the knotted dagger, I looked back at Sarit to make sure the struggle wouldn't hurt her in a moment, and even if I couldn't beat the young fellow, it would be too late to let Sarit escape. I moved slowly, trying to cover myself as best I could with the few handfuls of short bushes and weeds beside me. If the crocodile couldn't see my movements clearly, it wouldn't take precautions. The end of a wooden stick with a sharp dagger probed gently over to it, near its open mouth. The jagged fangs are surrounded by an egg-colored upper and lower jaw, with no tongue and no visible throat. The stick had to be held steady and not touched before jabbing it, or it would instantly close its mouth and crawl over to attack me. The sun was soaking me to the skin, and the sweat from my brow kept getting into my eyes. I could not afford to be careless. I had to do everything I could to hunt it down, and maybe it would have enough meat to feed us for 4 days. Like an aimed shot, I aimed my sharp dagger squarely into its mouth, and with my feet powered up, I leaned forward, making enough of my shoulder to stab in sharply and viciously. My hands could feel the slippery sound of the dagger cutting through the eye of its throat and stabbing straight into its stomach. Suddenly, his wrists vibrated sharply and his arms went numb. This 1.5-meter long crocodile, dead bite the section of wooden stick in its mouth, rolled up. I do not dare to use too much brute force, for fear that the stick breaks in its belly. So I loosened my fingers moderately, letting the wooden stick tumble with its body. The crocodile must have been in excruciating pain, its hulking body lying on the wet mud like a dolphin leaping out of the sea and tumbling. Its hard back and white and yellow stomach wheeled and twisted. The more it twisted, the more intense the pain. But the crocodile did not know this. Instinctive reflexes made it unable to scurry forward, so that the wooden stick poked into the stomach many more along its sharp teeth. The strength of the struggle gradually weakened. Just now, in order to control its madness, I also sweating, sore arms. It is not large, but the destructive power of young life force outbreak is unexpected. The blood squeezing out of its throat during the struggle squirted out a lot on my arms and face. Again, I fired up my potential and P*** said the wooden stick as hard as I could, poking and prodding its guts as much as I could. It kills it completely, preventing the last breath left from biting me back. Sweat kept flowing into my eyes. My vision was blurred, but with my senses, I kept good control of the initiative to fight it. Finally, this stubborn and raw fellow was completely lifeless. Wiping the fishy blood around his eyes, he used both hands to flip the crocodile over, drew a second dagger, and began to slice through its abdomen. The internal organs and intestinal piles inside were badly damaged, and the crocodile blood soaked through the shoelaces tied to the dagger. I quickly untied it and wrapped it securely around my riding boots, so that I could make a break for it in case any other beasts were attracted by the smell of blood. The crocodile's belly reeked of heat and stench, and I was used to the smell of blood and didn't feel strongly enough to vomit. Sarit was still at a distance, looking anxiously towards me, and I waved my hand, signaling her not to come. Firstly, I was afraid that the brutal scene would frighten her, and secondly, I was afraid that there would be another sudden danger, and she would not be able to run away in time. Chapter 15. Heavy Running. I separated the skin and flesh of the crocodile with my dagger, the finely crafted meat threaded up with strips of pliable shrubbery and slung across my upper body, my nose scurrying full of the smell of fresh meat. As I rose to greet Sarit, I suddenly felt the quagmire sway before me. Some of the gray surface of the ground bulged as if huge creatures were sleeping underneath, awakening and arching fiercely out of the ground. My consciousness was a little blurred, and I thought that the island quake had struck, but I didn't feel a tremor under my feet, and when I looked more closely at the stacks of grass spread out in front of me, my blood rushed to my brain and my cold hairs shrugged. Run, run as hard as you can, run. Sarit was standing too far away to see what I had discovered, but she knew that it wasn't a joke, and judging from my tone of voice, an extremely dangerous situation must have arisen. Sarit is a shrewd girl, and follows the route coming over with precision and haste. She knew that the only way to get out of danger was to hurry herself so that she wouldn't slow me down. Don't look back, run as fast as you can. I was also running fast along the original route. We had to zigzag towards the stream. If we ran in a straight line, we could easily get stuck in the mud and get swallowed up. The sound of pikes pounding the ground behind me, the sound of shrubs crashing, became clearer and clearer, and I had to judge the speed at which I was being pursued to determine how much more I had to accelerate before I was caught in a gulp and torn to pieces. Hundreds of stout crocodiles, blackened, opened their bloody mouths and lunged at me in a frenzy. The dirt and grass were smashed by their raw tails, tossing them into the air like a cloud of dust and smoke. It was the smell of my crocodile slaughter that attracted them. Right at the remains of that killed crocodile, dozens of crocodiles piled up high, tearing and fighting for the flesh and blood of their own kind, as other crocodiles locked onto me as a target and continued their ferocious pursuit. Sarit, after all, is a soft girl and can't run as fast as I can to escape. Just in the moment I brushed past her, my left arm sharply copied her back and held her hostage as I ran hard. At first she yelped, thinking she had been touched by a fierce animal. Upon seeing it was me grabbing her, she instantly relaxed her body to match my increased running speed. The dense forest snatch and fresh meat slung across my naked upper body, lurching and snapping. The weapon was fortunately on safety, or it would have most likely gone off and shot through my arse and legs. Unwilling to leave this hard-won food behind, much less be torn to pieces by hundreds of crocodiles, I had no choice but to fight for my life and run. The wind whistled in my ears, and it felt like I was back on the battlefield. Hundreds of enemies were chasing and shooting at me while I was dragging my wounded comrades to escape, bullets flying densely over my shoulders and around my ears. However, dodging slugs is a matter of orientation, and running left or right will result in serious injury or death. Now, with hundreds of crocodiles chasing me, it's a matter of speed if you want to survive. The name Wayne was given to me because of my surprising speed on the battlefield and my luck in dodging bullets, and it has been with me for 11 years. At this moment, I was running to the limit, even surpassing my previous records, because Sarit was in me, and she was my woman, which transcended and made me transcend. There was also precious food that could be used to continue the lives of Poe, Miyu, and the baby. Bush branches and leaves clattered and swept under my legs. I didn't care if the plants had spikes or not. Fear and mission kept me from feeling pain for a while. The gully had appeared ahead of me, and as I raced, I adjusted my pace so that I had to leap high over the current. The sound of the wind behind me, no need to look to feel. This group of crazy crocodiles are very close. As long as I slipped, I can never get up. Whoosh sound. Use my whole body strength to jump up. This is like my mercenary career in the devil training. Over the tall obstacles. It was followed by the sound of a thick landing. Immediately, I felt my legs go numb and vibrate raw. Sarit flung herself out of my arms in the process. I couldn't hesitate, snatching her from the fallen ground and swinging onto the tall boulder in front of me. Then taking 2 steps back to help myself, I tumbled over it as well. As soon as I lay down on the top of the hot rock, my whole body immediately went limp and weak, panting eagerly and promiscuously. Sarit sat up and shielded my eyes from the sun's rays with his hands. Below the rocks, the big, strong, fastest-running crocodile had dashed across the stream, followed by the fierce crash of the stream as hundreds of crocodiles arrived one after the other. Fortunately, they could not jump or climb, but could only surround the boulder in a mass, demonstrating to us both with their ugly, vicious mouths open. This boulder was like God's big life-saving hand, and the winding valley against which it rested was like God's arm reaching down from the sky. Sarit and I were able to climb up the rough, bumpy rock wall and leave this treacherous quagmire at the other end. It took a good hour of lying on the boulder to slowly get my breath back, the rock face burning my bare back unbearably. Sarit didn't say a word, eagerly taking care of it and wiping my sweat away. I sat up slowly and touched her shoulder and cheek, and breathed a long sigh of relief knowing that all was well. Sarit couldn't hold back any longer when she saw me slowing down, and all of a sudden she jumped into my arms and burst into tears. She was terrified by what she had just seen, and I held her in my arms, my palm patting her tender spine to soothe her. It was only then that I saw clearly under the boulder. Hundreds of crocodiles staggered stacked together, green-brown spine, scales glittering. They are of different sizes, small less than a meter, large 3 or 4 meters, angrily open their mouths to me, above the sharp teeth, calling people to shudder. Some were seduced by the smell of blood on my body and drilled in clusters, rolling their thieving eyes in anxiety. I pressed my right hand on the back of Sarit's head, not to let her look down. The horror of the scene would frighten her. Then we both got up and climbed up the slope of the valley, me behind Sarit, and when we came to a steep place, we hastened to hold her bottom with our hands to prevent her from suddenly rolling down. The group of crocodiles at the bottom of the hill were still slow to disperse. The descent down the hill was smoother but needed to be slowed down, and for the steeply sloping sections I climbed down before picking up Sarit. The quest to find spices and sea salt was abandoned today, as with the crocodile meat the group was able to scrape by for a few days. It was nearly evening when we returned to the cave. I saw from a distance that the wooden door of the cave was well covered, and I was very happy in my heart. Entering the cave, Miyu and Po were extremely happy to see us back safely, and Po ran over to me and jumped into my arms, much to my surprise. "Sarit, you rest well? Before it gets dark I'll go and gather some branches for grilling food." After saying that, he cut off a large piece of crocodile meat with his dagger, roasted it over the fire for a while, and led the way out of the cave door. I climbed a large tree nearby, hung the half-roasted piece of meat at the right height, quickly got some more dry wood, and quickly hurried back to the cave. Miyu's gentle eyes held a curiosity when she saw how quickly I came back. Knowing that they had all been hungry all day, I told them that they could barbecue the crocodile meat in the evening and sleep soundly after eating their fill. If that giant bear still comes to the neighborhood to forage for food at night, the crocodile meat hanging on the tree will confuse its sense of smell and hold back its appetite, meaning that it will not be able to eat, but also be unwilling to leave and be entangled in drooling under the tree for the rest of the night. Everyone started laughing after hearing what I said. In fact, I wasn't sure that doing that would work, and it was tantamount to gambling with myself, and to comfort the women and make them relax a bit. The skin of the crocodile is rough and ugly, but the meat inside is nutritious and juicy, and I cut the meat into thin slices and stuck them on a red-hot stone, which would cook quickly. The girls were much happier as they picked it up with twigs and ate it. At night, Po still wanted me to carry her to bed. Sarit, after lying down beside me, took the initiative to hug my back and put her thin, soft arms gently on my ribs. Miyu could see the attachment of the two girls to me, which was beginning to show visibly, and hid her handsome little mouth in a snigger. Miyu, after lying down beside me, took the initiative to hug my back and put her thin, soft arms gently on my ribs. Twice during the night, Miyu got up to take a leak, and from her movements and breathing, deduced that she was already half-healed and would look like a healthy woman in another 10 days or so. Although I was exhausted, I couldn't fall asleep, thinking about whether I would succeed in tricking the giant bear and how I would later turn the swarms of crocodiles in the quagmire into food. The crocodile meat was delicious and contained a great deal of salt in its body, so that we did not have to worry about sea salt. And the fact that there was such an amazing number of crocodiles in that open quagmire undoubtedly provided us with unlimited food. However, the thought of running for my life during the day made me break out in a cold sweat. I would not be able to fight them physically. Bullets are very precious, and shooting crocodiles is not a permanent solution. I am afraid I will not be so lucky to escape again if I walk into a dangerous quagmire and hunt with a crude spear, as I did today. What happens to them and the kids if I slip up? I'd be pushing them to the brink of extinction as well. The women are all sleeping very solidly. Good will perfunctory sometimes also right. Po has been used to sleeping in my arms position, soft and slender legs wrapped around my waist. She is only 13 years old, if we can live on the island for a long time. One day she will grow into a beautiful big girl, still like tonight like this floor in my arms to sleep to say, I do not know what will happen. Sarit had worked very hard during the day, sweating all over, and when I went to collect firewood, she had already bathed in the stream in front of the cave, although I had instructed them not to take half a step out of the cave door when I was not there. But Sarit wanted to wash her body and sleep close to me, so how could I chastise her? To allow me to be caring to her only, but not to allow her to be caring to me is also an arrogant constraint. I was the strongest man in this cave, able to obtain food and protect the women, but without them, without their bodies and love, my soul would suffer. With that thought, and Po already asleep, I gently withdrew my arm and rolled over to take Sarit in my arms. Sarit had cried on my back, and I hadn't cared about her tears at the time. Just wanted to focus all my energy on protecting them. At the moment, I could stop thinking about the giant bear and the crocodile and wrap my arms and legs around Sarit, my little fiancée. Her forehead was white and tender. Her lips were beautiful. I didn't know how to show care to a sleeping beautiful girl, so I kissed her forehead with my lips. I hope she doesn't have nightmares, doesn't miss her family, and doesn't cry alone in secret.